Hey everyone, Mecha here, and today I'm going to rank all the Fire Emblem games based on how difficult they are on the hardest difficulty. I'm pretty much going to focus on just the hardest difficulty in the game, which is going to make things a little bit weird later on, but I think that makes the most sense because Fire Emblem games on normal or other low difficulties tend to be very similar, and I want to make something that distinguishes them from one another. I'm going to try and factor in my own experience as well as what I think the average blind or non-blind experience is, so maybe someone goes in knowing what the game does on normal mode and then tries to get on hard, stuff like that. But it depends, it differs from game to game. In the end though, this is just a very non-serious tier list, like don't, pin me down on the super hard. This is just me doing it off the cuff. I did make a tier list beforehand, so I have an idea where I'm putting everything, but in the end, it's not the be-all, end-all of tier lists. So let's get into it. We'll start with Fire Emblem 1, Shadow Dragon the Blade of Light. I throw this in very easy because the enemies in this game are just so weak. Almost anyone you use in the long term is going to outgrow the enemies by many paces, especially someone like the Christmas Cavaliers. The game was made with the idea that you're going to reset for unit deaths and it just tries to kill Marth all the time, which is another very abusable fact, the fact you just poop Marth next to a frail character and then they'll just go for Marth because they're trying to game over you. Because they assume you don't reset for dead characters. But if you do reset for dead characters, then someone like Kain or Abel or anyone else really just pops off and starts one-running everything. Even if you do Iron Mana though, I don't think it's super tough. Now there are a couple of spots in FE1 where you might get a little bit of trouble if you play the map straight. Maybe maps with mana keys give you some trouble, or there's some other reason that you're having a hard time. But that's when FE1 gives you the other stupidly busted tool that is infinite range warp. You just get a infinite range warp in chapter 3 from Lena, and she just uses it at base. It has like a gazillion uses, it feels like, and you can use it to trivialize almost any map you don't, want to play. Either you just straight up warp skip it with a stacked Marth, or you use warp in some other way that distracts enemies so you don't have any trouble with it. Having the ability to put any character anywhere on the map makes the map just completely non-difficult, and I like that they gave this kind of an out to a very new kind of game. Like SRPGs were not super big back then at all, and the way they gave you players an out to this I think is fine for the time. It doesn't mean I think FE1 holds up very well today, it absolutely doesn't, but I think it's a good idea to make it on the easy side just to make sure you can actually beat the game, because everyone knows if you can beat a game you're actually more likely to keep playing it or other entries in the franchise. So FE1 that way, it holds up in its legacy, but it doesn't hold up as a game that's actually fun to play. But it is rather easy. Difficulty is not the main reason why it's hard. Next up we got Gaiden, FE2. This is, I think, a slightly harder but still very easy game. The reason I'm making it a little bit less easy than FE1 is, for one, the infinite range warp is still available, but you have to work to get it. Someone like Silk needs to get warp, learn it as a spell while leveling up. Quite a few times. I think she starts at level 1 and has to get to 7, but don't quote me on that. Either way, she has to level up, and she's pretty horrible at leveling up herself. So if you don't know that you should do this, then you're never going to do it. So a blind player might not stumble into warp. And even a player that has to know how to get warp, so has to work through it. So that's like one hurdle. FE2 is also routes. Like all the maps are routes besides the final one, and instead of seas, so that's hard to trivialize in the first place. Of course, the enemies are not particularly difficult to kill, but FE2 enemies do have or FE2 player characters do have pretty horrendous growth, so they don't outstat the enemies by quite as much. And if you still focus most of your resources into a low amount of characters like you should do in FE2, then if you do that, you're going to be just fine. You'll probably trivialize most of the things you see. But at the same time, if you just spread your XP around, I think you're still worse off than in FE1, for example, because you're still going to miss enemies all the time. Accuracy is pretty bad. Some enemies do actually have threatening stats. Something like an enemy Dread Fighter is still going to beat up your mage, for example. So class matchups are quite a bit more important. So for that reason, I think it's slightly harder, but still overall an easier game. So I'll put it in easy. Sorry, just getting rid of my phone here. Next up, we have FE3. I'm pretty sure it's going to go into easy categories as well. Yeah, I'm going to throw it in the bottom part, so over here. FE3 is honestly almost as easy as FE1. It's slightly more transparent, I think, compared to FE1, which hides most of its mechanics due to the outdated UI, whereas I think Mystery does like a slightly better job of dealing with it. It's also 2 books, and I do think actually that the map design from FE3 Book 2 is quite tough, but the enemies aren't strong enough to take advantage most of the time, and you can still overpower the enemies. But for example, if you look at the second chapter of FE3 Book 2, it kind of assumes that you know what you're doing when you're playing Fire Emblem. Like, if you go blindly into Book 2, you're going to be in for a rude awakening compared to Book 1. Book 1 is easy. Like, Book 1 is about the same difficulty as FE1, maybe slightly more, maybe slightly less. There's some things you don't have available anymore, and some things you do. But overall, I don't think it's a super different experience. But FE3 Book 2 is like, whoa, you better know what you're doing. So maybe that's a case for Book 2 being easy rather than very easy. But overall, I don't think it's super difficult. It's still very player-friendly with like the amount of resources it gives you. Some things that stand out to me are the against staff in FE3 Book 2, which allow you to just move all of your characters over again, including your dancer. You get a dancer, but you also get Zane to copy your best unit. You get Pala, who just destroys everything. And to be fair, most games give you a character that destroys everything, but Pala destroys like everything from beginning to end. It's kind of... Some games have more broken characters than others, so I still feel like FA3 belongs in very easy, but in the end, this is just splitting hairs. But just the star shards and the insane boosts they give characters to growths, all that stuff is just... It's a very fun game to play every once in a while, but I'm not going to say it's very difficult. Most of the early games, in fact, spoilers, are not very difficult. It's only getting hard later on. Next up is Genealogy, and Genealogy is weird because it's a little hard to place sometimes. Place and play. I'm going to put it in very easy, but this is kind of assuming that you can figure out how the mechanics work. If you have trouble with that, and you're trying to figure that out as you go, I can understand that your first run might lean more towards easy or even mid, because FE4 doesn't explain a whole lot, but at the same time it allows you to experience a lot just by doing it. And, you know, it doesn't explain to you how the pawn shop works, but when you buy and sell one item, you'll know how it works. And, you know, maybe you'll be down like 1,000 gold, but after that, you'll know what to do, right? So I think the whole game is kind of like that. It has some secret events that you don't want to miss, but at the same time, how hard does the game really become if you miss out on Lex's Brave Axe, for example? Not a whole lot. You might not figure out how pairings work exactly, like who inherits what, who should marry who, where all the secret bonuses at. If you don't look up those things, the game will be a bit harder, but at the same time it makes pretty clear what you should do sometimes for the most broken stuff, like having Lewin get 4 seti. And even when it doesn't, it just gives you so many tools that just wreck the game. Especially in Gen 2, with like Shannon always being there, Julia always being there, Oifi always being there, Ares always being there. You don't really need to make good pairings to make FE4 easy, I feel like. It just gets easier, like exponentially easier when you know what you're doing, and you know to pass down 4 seti to one of the kids, pair Bridget to get the U-Fell, promote Leaf as soon as possible. Like the knowledge is very rewarding in FE4, but even the base experience I think is not too hard. Like you get Sigurd from the start, and he can't die, you get a game over, so you're forced to always have Sigurd available. So no matter how much you screw up as the player, you'll have Sigurd. And Sigurd alone trivializes FE4, so I think it's fair to put it in very easy rather than easy. Next up is Thracia. This is going to be weird for my own experience, because I think for most people it's fair to put Thracia in hard or even very hard, depending on what they're doing. The blinder you are, the harder Thracia is. Now for me personally, Thracia is nowhere near the hardest game, and I would maybe even put it in mid for myself because I've played it so much. I've played it too much, probably. So I know the game like the back of my hand, and because of that, something like Fog of War affects me way less. I can not see in Fog of War, but I know where the enemies are almost all the time, for example. Someone who's playing blind, or who's only played it like once, is not going to do those kind of things, and so they'll be like looking around, it's like, oh, I need to move as if there's like three really strong enemies hidden behind in the fog that can kill me, whereas I'm like, oh, I'm just going to move my character there, because they're not going to die to whatever I know is there. I can warp blindly into the fog to just skip a chapter, because this game is, again, one that gives you infinite range warp. I can warp skip a Fog of War map, but someone who's playing somewhat blindly will not be able to. That makes a big difference. Generally, knowledge in Thracia is just so huge. Knowing something like the Manster twist is going to happen can drastically change the way you experience Chapter 4. Knowing that Avel can or cannot do certain things in Chapter 5 makes a massive difference in how you play that chapter and how stressful it feels when she's fighting. All these things really change how you experience Thracia. But at the core, this is a game that really punishes people who play completely blind, which is why I made that spoiler-free guide. If you haven't played Thracia because you're scared of it, that is one way that I know really helps people get into it. Because if you do kind of know what to do, I think the game becomes a lot less intimidating, and it has a lot more in common with like FE3, with how much it gives to players in regards to like broken personal weapons or the Thracia scrolls that boost your growth. The fact that a game gives you scrolls which are both growth, they both boost your growths and also function as iron runes you can just trade around. There's like 8 iron runes throughout the entire game, reasonably speaking, is so massive. You just ignore enemy crit most of the time. But you gotta know that. Same with like supports, for example. Those are not told to you or shown anywhere in the menu, but when you know they're there, you can practically almost always get +10 avoid and hit and everything else on your characters. That kind of stuff I think really makes a big difference in Thracia, but it does make a big difference, and that's why I think the amount of player knowledge and the player control that goes into it is pretty large, and so you have a massive effect on how hard the game will be for you. But I wouldn't count it as very hard. There's other games I think that count more. Thracia also only has one difficulty setting, really. It has Paragon mode, but that just makes it easier, not harder. Next up is FE6, aka the Binding Blade, and this is one that I think most people would probably put in the hard category. Not in the very hard one, because it's not that tough, but it does have a serious edge to it. This is the only GBA game I think that is not recommended for beginners, because it definitely feels a lot tougher than FE7 and FE8, for good reason. On normal mode, I think it's fine for most blind players, and the fact that it locks you out of hard mode on the first playthrough, I think it's a good idea, because sometimes you might get like kind of lured into hard mode as a first timer, thinking, I know strategy games, I'll go into hard. And then if you play hard as your first FE6 experience, you're probably going to get creamed. But assuming hard mode, you do have to deal with quite a lot of chapters initially that already test your fundamentals. Trying to figure out how to get Marcus to fight things while still training things up in the meanwhile can be quite tough. Like chapter 1 is pretty straightforward, right? Marcus weakens things with the Iron Sword, and then Roy, Alan, and friends just finish them off. But as you go on and you fight different types of enemies, it gets kind of complicated fast. And people that are not Marcus, or maybe like Deke in the early game, or Rutger, they struggle quite a bit. I like to cite Walt doing 1 damage to chapter 4 Cavaliers personally. This game is pretty tough initially. The difficulty does slope downwards, I think, as you get into the Western Isles. Enemies' stats, they are still quite high, but they're not as tough compared to your characters as in the early game. FE6 also has that weird bug where for the first, I want to say 5 chapters, the enemies have an extra added hard mode bonus, you know, just to make things a little bit tougher on you. So that also doesn't help with the first time experience on hard mode if you somehow were to do that. But I think most people just generally think FE6 is a fairly hard game. Even on normal mode, some things about FE6 are just super annoying to handle. The main one, I think, being ambush spawns. Nobody likes ambush spawns. They're in Thracia too, but they don't impact it as much as they do in FE6. FE6 probably has too many of these. FE6 probably just said, yeah, let's make sure that we have this chapter designed. Oh, and let's add some ambush spawns on top of it. It's kind of annoying, and I don't blame anyone for disliking it for that. But it's part of the game, and it makes it more difficult, so I'm going to put it on hard. Then we have FE7. This is a mid, I think, and it's kind of weird. When I initially made this list, I was like not sure if I should make a mid or not, because I thought everything could be classified as hard or easy. But thinking about it more, I think FE7 is like the perfect fit for mid, and I don't think anything else reaches that weird difficulty. So Hector hard mode is the hardest difficulty in the game by far, and it's also the funniest difficulty from like everything we've discussed so far, because it's one of the few maps that doesn't just make maps harder, but it also changes their design around completely. The most obvious example being Cog of Destiny, where it takes an entire map of enemies and replaces them with an entirely different group of enemies. It says, hey, this is Hector hard mode now. But other maps have like slightly cute changes about them as well, that I think really show that they maybe not extremely tested the game, but they did want to make Hector hard mode a different experience. Think of like how they put the silver card in hard mode only for some weird reason. Think of like that extra thief in the Raven chapter that helps open the doors faster so that the enemy thieves get to the treasure faster, like the Nightcrest and the Silver Sword chests. I'm thinking like Genesis, where I forgot exactly what makes it different. Oh, it's the fact that Kushina moves makes it a little bit different, I think, because in normal mode he just stands still and doesn't leave until you attack him, I think, or like open the door. But in Hector mode he leaves at or Hector hard mode, I think he leaves turn 5 always. I don't remember why, but Hector Heart mode is like extra strange about Genesis. Chapter 4 too, Live in Legend, I think Hector Heart mode is the only mode that has the Fog of War there. But it has the cool change where if you are prepping, you still see every enemy, and then when you start the chapter, the sandstorm sets in kind of, and you actually get fog, and you can no longer see anything, but you can still know where everything is beforehand. You just have to kind of memorize it, figure out where these enemies are coming from. So it's one of the only times I think in all of Fire Emblem where you get to prep without fog, and then you start the chapter and fog turns on. I think it's really cool. Lots of other chapters have Fog of War without the preps disabling it. I'm not sure why they made that change there, but it's actually like very cool. I'm not super big on FE6 map, like FE7 map design as a whole, but those details I think really stand out to me as some kind of cool design decision. Sometimes they like go a little bit overboard, like how the value of life, that Hector mode only chapter, in hard mode it's all berserkers. It's every enemy to a berserker said this is your life now. There's also the fun fact where the final boss has a chance, depending on stat rolls, to one-shot Athos. But depending on how it goes, he might not, which is super strange to me as well. So yeah, Hector Heart mode is just funny. So why does that all make it mid? Well, for one, you're not able to play Hector Heart mode until you've beaten the game twice already. So no matter how you're going into Hector Heart mode, you'll be very experienced with the game, unless you like download a save file. But even then, you're probably not doing that until you've beaten the game at least once, I think. And then the stats of the enemies, I remember back when FE7 was maybe not relatively new, but when I was like online in like the GameFAQs IGN days, like long ago, maybe what is it, like 10 years, I feel old. When Hector Heart mode was like somewhat not undiscovered, but not played as much, it was like people doing play logs of Hector Heart mode, like, oh, this is so hard, and all. In Hector Heart mode, the enemies are like really strong, you have to use Marcus more. This was a bad deal back then. It's like, oh, you have to use Marcus, it's so tough. And it really gives this kind of feeling of being pressured, even though FE7 enemies, now we know they're just Garbo. You can just Marcus them all, and then by the time Marcus is even close to falling off, you get like 5 more good pre-promotes, and your units outgrow the enemies by a lot. But back then it felt really intimidating to a lot of people, me included. My first Hector Heart mode playthrough, I had a blast trying to get through it. Now most people think of Hector Heart mode as like, oh, it's that mode where you get like -5 deployment slots every chapter and the XP gain is bad, and those things are bad, but they do also make the game more difficult, and when you're still new to the mode, those things are less noticeable than just how much harder the map become when you're playing suboptimally. That said, now with the knowledge we have today, the game is easier to trivialize than ever. We know just how easy it is to double all the enemies. We know how hard they fall off in the mid-game speed-wise because they start carrying steel weapons. Very few enemies have 1-2 range as well. The bosses in Hector Heart mode are high stats, but they're rarely really a threat to the point where you have to care a whole lot about their stats, because you can just beat them at their own game with your own superpowered characters. So it's that weird balance between hard and easy, I think. Overall, if you ask most people, they would say this is one of the easier Fire Emblems, but that might be because they don't really play the first 3. I think those are easier by far, but people don't really care about them as much, so they think of FE7 as like an easy game. It's probably because FE7 has a lot of exposure as well, so it gets discussed more often as an easy FE. But I do think it's significantly harder than some of the other easy games we're going to discuss today, but also easier than some of the harder games, so I think it fits well in the middle. And I don't think there's any other game I would fit in the middle, but if you disagree, let me know in the comments. So FE8, I think to no one's surprise, is going to go in some of the easier categories. I'm going to put it in the very easy one because I don't think this game is super hard. This is, I think, the one game I have never played completely vanilla on the channel, just because it's too boring to play it normally. It's very... the map design in FE8 is actually not that simplistic. There are some maps that if you crank up the enemy stats or add some kind of personal challenge, it can get hard very quickly. But because your characters are like FE7s, but with like buffs to like 10% of each of their stats, and because the enemies are weaker than FE7s, even on a hard mode, and because your own character's damage set is just ridiculous, the pre-promotes are all slightly better than FE7s too. It just doesn't manage to challenge the player in a meaningful way, with some exceptions. It does have a couple of chapters that would make me consider putting it in easy instead of very easy. It's not a totally brain dead game if you take into account like Phantom Ship, for example. That's a map that gives a lot of players trouble. Last Hope, if you don't kill Rev on like one of the first few turns, it does get pretty overwhelming. But with the knowledge we have today, you can still like use a choke point, either the choke point like the bottom of the map, or go in the treasure room and hide there. That's a trick I use every now and then. So FE8, it's still hard to challenge you with, even if you somewhat engage with the maps there. It's just not a very difficult game if you don't hold back. If you do hold back in some way or crank the game up, it can get harder very easily, but I really don't think it qualifies for easy, even though there are some chapters that can give you a new player trouble. There's like one more map that there's a couple maps that are like kind of challenging-ish. Like the early game is all easy, but chapter 6, for example, when I was new to Fire Emblem, gave me a lot of trouble. I was like, oh, how do I save the civilians from getting eaten by the spider? He's coming down so fast, and I was like, I had no idea where to go or when to fight a boss, even though the cutscene basically tells you. Or there's like chapter 13 Ephraim routes, where you have to fight Selena. She's in the middle, and she can bolting like almost the entire map because she's positioned so cleverly. I was like, oh, that's so hard, and now I just make sure to get someone in her attacking range as early as possible and then kill her, and then the map kind of plays itself. It's just kind of long, but it's not exactly difficult. It becomes more like a revelation map, if anything. So, and then like what else is there? Like there's some chapter, like the Scorched Sand chapter, for example, the desert chapter. It definitely trips me off every now and then. I've definitely had some unfortunate deaths in that chapter, but it's really, I can't even call it as hard as Hector hard mode personally. So I would be tempted to keep FE8 here, but if you wanted to put FE8 on easy instead of very easy because of those maps, I would fully understand. It's just not the way I experience it personally. Okay, FE9 I think also goes in very easy. I think this is the easiest Fire Emblem game in the franchise, at least the easiest modern Fire Emblem game. If we leave out like the really old titles, FE1 and FE3, for a moment, I think FE9 is the easiest Fire Emblem game we have, because this game just doesn't really challenge you in any meaningful way. The main challenge is like trying to fulfill bonus experience requirements and other side objectives, or like trying to steal things from enemies, like stealing physics or something. But the game just kind of beats itself almost with how strong the characters are. It's not that the enemies are super weak, but they generally don't kill you because your characters are just that bulky and strong. And the enemies can also get very bulky, especially on Maniac mode. I actually forgot to factor in Maniac mode when making my initial list. But even Maniac is just not that hard. It's still just tedious and long. But maybe if you factored in Maniac mode, I could see it going here. But I want to keep it here just because I'm assuming English releases right now. But the way that they buff classes and characters from the previous entries that were already strong in the first place makes it so player-centered and so easy. Like things like the Night Ward giving a bonus to the mounted classes that were already so strong, the mounted units being able to move after attacking, like those kind of changes are just over the top. It's so easy. And FE9 English version has this weird bug that also kind of occurs in previous games, where promoted enemies can end up weaker than their unpromoted counterparts. So if you look at like a Swordmaster and a Myrmidon side by side, I think around the chapter 17, chapter 18 time, you'll find that sometimes the Myrmidon has some stats higher than the Swordmasters. I think that is a sign of a very, very easy game, and neither of them are very strong. Like to be clear here. So as long as you have like a basic concept of the weapon triangle, and you're not exposing like Reese to every enemy you see, I don't know how you can ever die in Path of Radiance. There's some parts that are maybe sort of hard. Like, if you try to keep all the goos alive in chapter 15 while beating the map within the bonus experience limit and getting all the items, yeah, that's tough. But that's a self-imposed challenge. If you make that just slightly easier for yourself, the map is still, like, very easy. I played FE9 on Ignorance mode, which means Path of Ignorance, basically. It means you don't check battle forecasts, you turn those off, you don't check terrain. You play, basically, you play with as little information as possible. And it was still a fairly easy game. There were some times where I died because I couldn't see the numbers, but if I did, I would 100% be able to avoid like almost all the deaths that I incurred on the way. So yeah, it's not a very difficult game. Radiant Dawn is very different though. I wouldn't put it in very hard, but I kind of want to put it in hard personally. Let me see where I initially placed it. Yeah, I put it in hard. So Radiant Dawn was very rough for people when it first released, and for people who were trying to get into Fire Emblem when they're playing it for the first time. because it really forces you to do things that new players sometimes don't want to do, or like semi-new players. Like the most common, the first pitfall was like what's the exact phrasing? Basically not using your pre-promotes, your early game jig. It's like a, pitfall. You should do that. And Radiant Dawn really hammers the lesson home, but people just don't want to, and so they get stuck early on, because the Dawn Brigade is so reliant on Soth to stay alive, and they just try to do everything with Nolan and Edward and Leonardo and Micaiah, and these units are not very good at fighting. Sometimes like it takes like 3 of them to take down 1 enemy sometimes. So you need someone like Soth to hold off the enemies. And if you're playing on Radiant Dawn's hard mode, it also has the enemy range turn off, which sucks. It's just a bad feature. I don't even factor it in here. I think the map design and the enemy power versus the player power of Radiant Dawn is enough to put it in hard. That said, I might be leaning too hard into the Dawn Brigade here, because after you get past the first bit of Radiant Dawn, you could argue that the game gets a lot easier. I still think, for example, Part 2 is reasonably difficult, especially like 2-3, Joffrey's Charge. That map is not super simple to solve. It's very easy for Joffrey to die if you make the wrong moves, by just a little bit. Or you can just get crit by the boss, that's also fun. Elincia's Gambit, if you don't trivialize it with hard using the hammer, it's not the easiest map in the world. Part 3, I think for the most part, is fairly easy. I can't really think of any exceptions, except like the Dawn Brigade chapters, because, yeah, those are, I would say 3-6 and 3-13 are hard. Not to the part where they get unfun, but just pretty difficult for most players. And after that, it really wildly depends on what you've trained and who you've trained and where you're going. I think a lot of people might get intimidated by the Part 4 maps and the endgame maps of Radiant Dawn. So, yeah. I think you could argue mid if you really think the maps are mostly easy. But for the most part, I think Radiant Dawn is fair where it is in hard. Alright, so next up is Shadow Dragon. This one goes in hard as well, because again, we're only taking into account the highest difficulty, which means this is hard 5. Very restrictive difficulty. Most characters either have a forged effective weapon and they can do something, or they tend to just not work in hard 5. So that alone, I think, tells you a lot about what you have to do to have a chance in hard 5. Especially the first few chapters of this game are just so rough, because you have no forged options, and you're relying basically just purely on limited stats and weapons to get through. And most units just don't have the stats to compete with the enemies. Like Jagan has a Silver Lance, and even with that, he can barely 1v1 the enemies. You have Ogma, who can maybe double some of the enemy fighters and pirates, but maybe not if he uses the Steel Sword. What's even next? Like Barst, he can kind of trade with enemies. He still gets 2-shot, and he 2-shots enemies back. That's pretty even. But the enemies outnumber you by so much that you need a bunch of teamwork. And most of the time, you'll probably end up sacrificing like 1 or 2 people who you don't really care about just to get through the early chapters if you're not playing super carefully. So this game is definitely super difficult at first. But then you get to chapter 4, you can make forges. You can forge the Wing Spear, then the Rider's Bane, and then maybe the Hammer in chapters 4, 5, and 6. And you're good to go. Pretty much every enemy to tweak to those is just trivial, and the only way to like have any trouble with them is like trying to figure out how to beat them without using those forges, or trying to use less uses of them, because they do carry you through a large part of the game. And then as you go through, you get more and more tools that just let you laugh at the game. You get ballisticians, I should say, which you can also forge and kill things with at 3 range, or 10 range, which is super safe. Sedgar and Wolf can be used, fairly easily trained as generals, and then maybe reclass to something else like hero if you want to. They trivialize the game pretty much if they get going. The easiest way to do it, I think, is doing it in chapter 8, just chucking one of them on a fort, having them chip a bunch of calves for a bunch of turns, then they're up and running. So that's another way to trivialize an otherwise hard game. That said, besides Sedgar and Wolf, most enemies in Shadow Dragon do still do a lot of damage to you if they get to attack you. I think most characters will get 2 or 3 shot. There are some tankier ones, and there's exceptions and all, but I think Shadow Dragon generally does a good job of at least being a threat to the player. So there's always going to be like forged enemy Rider's Banes. Enemies just getting forges in general is massive, like them getting like a forged Javelin. They get Braves at some point. It's a pretty good way to keep the game kind of hard, but you do still have that warp skip out. You do still have the ability to say, okay, if I can beat the boss in 1 turn, then all it takes for me to win the map is just use a couple warps and I'm done. So that still doesn't, I think that still disqualifies it from very hard, even though I think if the entire game was like the first 2 chapters, I would say it falls under very hard. But because of all these factors he's mentioned, I think it's fair to keep it in hard. I don't think it's fair to put it in mid, because you just don't have to get through those chapters, and even the chapters later on, as long as you play them straight, some enemies are not weak to the forges, and even though you can destroy enemies with forges, you don't have infinite forges. And if there's like 4 enemies out there that are weak to your forge, you still have to kind of be smart about training it around. So I think it's still a plenty difficult game, but I wouldn't put it like an entire tier above the other 3 that we have in this tier so far. So I think hard is about fair for Shadow Dragon. Next up is New Mystery, and this is going to be the first game that I'm putting in very hard. And this, I will admit, is mostly my personal thing, because this is one of the few games that I am just unable to master for myself, and mastering it is one of my goals for my remaining Fire Emblem career, is figuring out if I can actually laugh at this game as hard as some of the more experienced players are laughing at it, because this game can be brutal on higher difficulties. The highest I've beaten it, I think, is hard 2. I think it's called Maniac. The highest ones are Lunatic and Lunatic Reverse. And even just Lunatic alone, it drains me. I will say, as much as I respect this game's difficulty, I find myself not liking it enough to finish it. I have a bunch of abandoned playthroughs of this game, and at one point I do want to finish it. But it's not an easy game to finish, partially because of how harsh the enemies can be, but also partially because the game itself is just not super appealing to me. I know I'm not alone on this. I think FE12 is one of the least liked Fire Emblems in the fanbase as a whole. It doesn't help that it's Japanese only, or not released outside of Japan. That makes it hard for people to even try it. But when they do try it, I think a lot of people just kind of get bored with it. That said, it does have intense difficulty. It basically has all the DS tools, but it takes away the option to just trivialize everything with effective weapons, because you get less of them, or rather the enemies are not in classes that are easily wrecked by effective weapons. You have more enemies like, I don't know, berserkers, fighters, soldiers. You don't get like what's it called? You just have less ways to trivialize the maps, basically, is what I'm saying. It's as I'm trying to think of examples, all I can think of is like enemies that are weak to those things. The enemies just outstat you by a little bit more in the harder difficulties. And of course, if you only take into account the hardest difficulty, we have to talk about Lunatic Reverse, where enemies have auto advantage, meaning that they will always attack first, even if it's player phase. If you're trying to finish off an enemy, they will still attack you first, and that adds an extra attack you have to eat. Another quirk of the DS emblems that I didn't really talk about for Shadow Dragon, but that's very relevant for FE12 for me, is the lack of healing. Vulns exist, they heal 10, but I don't think you get elixirs in the main game. No concoctions like in Radiant Dawn, and so you'll have to rely on like your own healers quite a bit, and those also heal a lot less. I feel like in GBA, if you have someone get injured a lot, like if your Marcus is at 4 HP, Sarah or Priscilla just uses Mend once and they're basically ready to go for another 2 enemy phases. FE12, they'll heal like maybe 10 HP, maybe 12, maybe 14. The formula is a lot harsher, and so you don't get to heal as much, which makes HP management and healing management a lot tougher to do. I am of the style of where, like, it's okay, my unit just took a bunch of damage, I'll heal them, it should be good to go. But the DS Emblem says, no, you have to measure exactly how many enemies you want to face and distribute healing resources equally, or accordingly, and if you don't manage to do it properly, you'll probably die. And that, combined with the fact that dodging is kind of difficult in the DS Emblems as well, it just makes it a lot harder to manage the enemies. You do get some very strong characters, of course. You do get Pala still. The FE3 book Pala is as broken as ever. You have Chris, the Avatar, who's absolutely insane. If you reclass him to, if you start in Knight or reclass him to General at some point, he's obviously going to tank a lot of things. But the game is sort of prepared by the way that mages can fry generals and the way that enemy armor slayers and hammers are around. So even that trick doesn't work as well as it did in Shadow Dragon with Setgar and Wolf. So the game is prepared. That said, I know there's a lot of people who know how to trivialize this game, and they'll probably just laugh at me as I'm saying all this. But I do think this game is legit. Possibly the hardest in the franchise, played on the highest difficulty. I think there's like one game that competes maybe. But generally this is the hardest game, but this is heavily influenced by how hard I find it personally. It's just that it's the game that I think that has the fewest easy win buttons. There is a warp staff, but only in the lower difficulty, so for the sake of this discussion, I can pretty much ignore the entire warp staff existing, and that means you're left with like the rescue staff, which is not nearly as good. And just the lack of the ability to just stomp through the entire game is something. But hey, if you know how to beat FE12, let me know. I will say I know most of the tricks. I know like AI manipulation is a thing you can do, and I frequently try to do that as I'm playing through the game. But I find that method is a lot less intuitive than the way that you math out combat in previous games. So the fact that it's almost required to AI manipulate in some ways is, I think, another testament to how hard this game is on the hardest difficulty. So FE12 I think is my personal hardest game out of here. Now the next entry is also for very hard, and that's Awakening. This one might surprise you, and I think you can argue that it should be in hard. The reason I'm putting it here is because Awakening has the most annoying highest difficulty in Lunatic Plus. I have not played a whole lot of Lunatic and Lunatic Plus myself, but I've heard so much about it that I think it's fair to put it up here. I do believe there are people out there who believe that Lunatic is not as bad as everyone is saying, but I do believe everyone knows Lunatic Plus is as bad as everyone's saying. RNG determined skills that are enemy only, that make enemies do things like always hit you with Hawkeye Plus, negate your defenses or half your defenses with Luna Plus, counter, you know, if you're adjacent, you attack an enemy, or if you damage an enemy, I should say, then they will do, I think, half or whole the damage back to you, even if it's enemy phase. So if a counter enemy runs up to you, you might just end up, you know, Sudokuing yourself. All these things are super harsh to deal with, on top of just a massive stat inflation on enemies in Awakening. If you've only played normal or hard, this might be a super surprising entry, and I still have trouble grasping with it, because I will get into why Awakening can be argued for hard instead, but I think it belongs in very hard. So if you have an enemy in Awakening, just a general dude, he'll probably one-shot like the weaker units of your army early on, and later on they'll maybe do a little bit better than that. Maybe you can survive a couple hits, but someone like Stahl or Vake or whatever, they tend to get one-rounded or like brought to super low HP. It's insane. And you do have Robin in Awakening, and you do have Frederick, so those can get you very far. Frederick himself is key to getting through at least chapter 2 for sure, but definitely all the early game. He is so powerful, and Lunatic and Lunatic Plus pretty much force you to use him almost all the time. Like if you can get kills with Robin, that's great, but if you kill almost half of that with Frederick, I totally understand why. And then Robin, if you can get Robin going, obviously he trivializes Awakening, probably even Awakening Lunatic Plus. There's probably some spots where Robin can still die, especially when enemies with counter get involved. But generally I believe that Robin trivializes Awakening to the point where I think you can argue that it belongs in hard instead. But just the first couple chapters alone in Lunatic Plus I think should convince anyone that at least it belongs up here somewhere. I think if you put Awakening in hard instead, you could argue that FE12 belongs there as well. The other thing about Awakening, I think, is that it can be a little bit luck-based with the way the mechanics work. Something like a timely dual strike or dual guard can completely change how a map is going for you. Like, you could be dying and then you get saved by a dual guard, and it feels almost undeserved. So that makes it not just less difficult, but also less fulfilling in a way. And that goes for like all these luck-based things that are in Awakening, like the Anna shop and randomly appearing on the map. Being able to use Renown to buy things. I guess it's not as luck-based, but it does feel like it's outside of the main game. Glowing tiles giving you like super strong weapons like Celica's Gil. So how hard Awakening is definitely a bit RNG dependent, I think, compared to other games where these kind of events just don't exist. But overall, Lunatic Plus is something else. Next up, we got the Fates games. I'll start with the obvious one, Conquest. I personally put this in hard. If you ask me this tier list like a year ago, 2 years ago, something like that, I might put Conquest in very hard because I didn't have a great grasp of Fates. While right now it's still not my most familiar game, not the game I have the most experience with, I have played it a couple more times in various ways, and so I'm a bit more familiar with the mechanics, what classes are good, what moves are good, what maneuvers are good, what characters are good, how reclassing works, how skills work. All these little details, they're becoming more and more clear to me, and so I'm a bit more familiar with Conquest. I finished another run on hard, and I think while Lunatic and hard are very different, I think overall that who is good and who is not doesn't change that much between hard and Lunatic. The enemy stats are the same, it's just they have more skills, but the overall way everything compares to one another doesn't change all that much, I think. So I think I'm sort of qualified to talk about hard. I also finished Lunatic with a friend a while ago, so basically I have some of the hard and Lunatic experience. So the reason I think Fates was very hard at first for me is just not being familiar enough with the game, the maps, the enemy layout, and the skills especially, and the classes especially, to figure out how everything worked. And I was getting kind of analysis paralysis from Fates, like the enemy skills are just very unintuitive to me. But now I can usually tell what an enemy will do at a glance, which is so much easier to analyze. And I've learned that if you stat stack your characters hard enough, you make the right pairings, the right setups, you optimize your turn ones and you optimize your tonics a little bit, you can kind of ignore a lot of the things that were giving me trouble before. Whereas before I would be like, oh, this enemy has this and this and this thing, that's scary. Now I could be like, well, I just make sure my character one-rounds them and I don't have to worry about these, like seal skills and like the ninja debuffs. Well, not ninjas, because if they hit you, they do it anyway, but you know what I mean, right? Debuffs can be ignored if you want to kill the enemy most of the time. So that is really a huge load on my back. I think that makes the game a bit easier. I still would put it in hard, because I think for most players, Lunatic Conquest is still very hectic, and there's a lot of maps that can just mess you up. But the fact that this game gives you Camilla in Chapter 10, unit that has enough bases to just kind of walk through the game and storm it entirely. Units like Xander can do the same. I know how to make Corrin super broken to also do these kind of things. Make the right pairings to make Corrin even better than she is before. Used Corrin to make other characters really busted. Set up something like a Vantage Life and Death builds to one-shot a bunch of enemies. All this knowledge just made me think Conquest, while a base is a very hard game, it's not harder than everything else for me anymore. So right now I rate it about here. But depending on your experience, you might still experience that analysis paralysis I was talking about earlier, and then for you, Conquest might be up here. But yeah, if you use your tools, the things you have in Conquest properly, I think it's more hard than extra, ultra, super hard. And it doesn't have anything like Lunatic Plus or Lunatic Reverse like some of the other games do. The other Fates entries, obviously not nearly as difficult. Birthright and Revelations. I'm just trying to see which one I want to... let's do Birthright first. I put Birthright in the very easy category, all the way down below. I don't think it's hard at all. And I think most people would agree. It has a couple chapters that make me scratch my head a little bit. They're mostly in the early game where you don't have access to that many characters. I'm thinking of the map that I think is originally... In Conquest, I think it's the one where you fight Zola. It's the one where you start in that little cramped room and there's enemies all around outside. And you have to go up and kill the boss and get some thieves before they escape. And you get like a couple ninjas and Corrin and Jacob, and you don't have many options is basically what my point is. And that one can be a little bit tricky. And similarly, the ninja map that comes, I think, right after, it's like slightly hairy. But the main difference, I think, between Conquest and Birthright in this respect is that the maps in Conquest feel like more the enemies put more pressure on you. The reinforcement zones are more tightly designed, and the enemies are more aggressive overall, so it never feels like you've trivialized the map. You can just bait and switch everything else. Whereas in Birthright, I felt like every enemy just kind of stood still until they were ready to attack me, and they didn't even like move in groups a whole lot. So that made them a lot more trivial. And then Birthright has its own like slew of super broken characters that just roll over the game. Ryoma's the most famous, but you can turn anyone into a murder machine on Birthright with like some very slight knowledge of the Fate system. So even though I found Birthright was like a little sloggy to get through the first time, the second time I played it, I just built like a couple really powerful characters. In my case, it was, I think, just a ninja Kagero, very vanilla, and a very strong Sakura with like life and death vantage shenanigans. It was very fun. Like, don't get me wrong, I actually like Birthright a lot better now that I understand Fates a lot more. But it's not super difficult, and I don't think anyone disagrees. I've heard some people say that they don't actually think Ryoma's the best character in Fates because there are other characters that can do the one-rounding, survive everything thing that he does, but with more mobility and more options, which I'm very curious about. So that's like a part of the meta of Birthright that I have not discovered for myself, if that's even true, that is. But I do think I have enough knowledge to know that Birthright is rather easy. I have Rev a bit higher up, which might surprise you, as far as like difficulty goes. Not because it's a better game, I definitely have more fun with Birthright than Revelations still, even though I am replaying both. The problem with Rev is that the maps kind of lull you into a false sense of security. You get bored with how lame the map is, and then suddenly your characters are at risk of death because you just wanted to get it over with, so you're just moving them in enemy range and suddenly you're dead. That's the experience with Rev for me in a nutshell. But you do still have all these royals from both Conquest and Birthright, so you can just pick and choose the best ones. I know for my first playthrough in Fates, I just went with Brioma, Xander, Camilla for the most part. The others are like a little bit worse, but those are all like super busted still. And what I've learned on my most recent Revelation playthrough, the one I'm doing for All Games Draft, is you just turn people into flyers, and then the maps are just kind of even more laughable than they were already, because you can just ignore whatever they're trying to throw at you. Doesn't work for every map, of course, but it means that you can ignore like all the terrain it throws in your face and just fly over everything. I know this is something that most people that play Rev already know, but just in case you want to make Rev less tedious for yourself, invest in more flyer stonks. It will really help you out. I do think Rev is like an okay sandbox experience, but it does mean you kind of create your own difficulty almost. So it's hard to make Rev difficult without having to do some of your own game designing. And I think that's always a bit of a flaw in difficulty design. So I don't think anyone's surprised that Rev is a little more flawed than Birthright or even Conquest. But one thing I will say about Fates is that I think what makes it a bit harder is the map design is a bit more hostile to the player, and it has, especially the Vala arc, some enemies that feel less trivial. Like something like a combo of like a bunch of Mars ninjas can definitely throw you off and murder you. The enemies still don't have skills like in Birthright, but I don't know, it feels less trivial to me than Birthright. I don't know if it's worth it to be like an entire tier higher though, so I could see it being in very easy instead. But for me, Fates feels a bit more difficult, also because it lulls you into sleep. Whereas I feel like Birthright was just a bit more entertaining in that regard. I don't know why, because Birthright maps aren't exactly exciting either, but they feel less offensively boring to me at the very least. It doesn't help that Rev kind of reuses Birthright's designs a lot, or Conquest designs, and it makes it worse, like the port chapter. That one is so bad, I hate it. But yeah, I think Rev is overall like just fairly easy. I don't think anyone will disagree. Then we have Echoes. I don't think anyone will hate me for saying that Echoes is easy. I'm just trying to see where exactly I put it. I didn't order these within the tier, by the way. I just put them from left to right, in case anyone's wondering. Someone's probably going to comment like, oh god, how is Radiant Dawn harder than Shadow Dragon? The answer is I don't think so. I just think they're all individually about as hard as each other in this tier. Anyway, Echoes, I think, goes in very easy. It has some parts that are difficult, but overall, it feels more like you're just playing an RPG that you just bash your head against and try to get through than a technically challenging game. I mean, it uses the same maps as Gaiden, so how hard can it really be, right? I think it's easier than Gaiden because it has a lot more... Most of the changes made are player-friendly. Something like the Comet Hearts, even though they're very secretive, any one you can pick up is going to be an advantage for you. So if you can find something like Hunter's Volley on your first playthrough, congrats. If you know about Hunter's Volley, it makes the game like 5,000 times easier. The Killer Bow alone will make things a lot easier. The forging system is a big change. Supports existing between characters is going to make it easier. You do have reduced warp range in this game, so the warp thing is not entirely there. But like I said, the fact that the maps are route and not warp means that trivializing it with a single warp is not as easy in this game as it is in like the Marth games. So that's why I don't think that impacts a whole lot in that regard. And you still have plenty of range to where warp can make a difference anyway, so it still makes the game very easy. I do really love Shadows of Valentia like as a game, but I think it's more just a well-represented like experience than something that's technically interesting. So that's why I don't rate it very high. I think this is one of my favorite games, like top 3 Fire Emblem games, but not because it's challenging. It's just because it's fun. It's just very charming, but the amount of options the player gets in this game, compared to the enemies especially, is just absurd. So I don't think I have to qualify a whole lot why I think it's that way. Then we get to 3 houses, and 3 houses, I'm going to put it in easy, but not very easy. And the reason for this is I think 3 houses is a bit tough to figure out exactly how to go about things on the hardest difficulty. Maddening at first is of course a very maddening experience. I don't think anyone will go into Maddening completely blind, but if they did, they would definitely get, well, blindsided by the strength of the enemies. The fact that some of your characters get one-rounded, and the meta is generally just to chip enemies down with repeated bow attacks so you can finish them, and that's like one enemy that requires like half your armor to kill. I think that's a good testament to how difficult 3 houses can be on Maddening. At the same time, once you do figure it out a little bit, it kind of becomes trivial, and some maps are laughably trivial. I think my favorite example is the Dimitri route only map in part 2, where the boss is just up on a ledge, and if you have stride and a flyer, you win the map, and it's just over, and everything else you're doing is a self-imposed challenge. It has those kind of maps. It also has a couple maps where it's actually really tough to skip, but they're very rare, and most maps don't punish you for trying to do this. But for example, Blue Lion's final map, I think, is very difficult in maddening. So it definitely has a balance of those things, but I don't think it's enough for it to be mid, because I still think that the meta choices for Three Houses, they just completely ruin so many kill boss only maps. Like the fact that you have Dance of the Goddess available, the fact that you have Stride available, the fact that you have Gardening Staff pushes available, just how good the Wyvern Lord class is, just how good Edelgard is with the Amir, or Dimitri with Vantage Wrath, these kind of things. So really just how good the best choices are in the game at just making the game brain dead, I think makes it belong in easy. But I will say that when maddening first came out, we were definitely all in collective shock at how much it changed the game, because most people thought hard was kind of boring in Three Houses. I would not be surprised if most people, if you made this tiers before maddening came out, Three Houses would be in the exact same spot. And then maddening took us all by surprise by just how much it buffed the enemy, and especially the ambush reinforcements definitely changed a lot about how the game is played. So if you wanted to put Three Houses in mid for how much that shock was, I would not blame you. At the same time, the amount of boss kill maps, which is are just trivial. Think of like the Lawrence Paralogue, where you can just fly over the river and kill the boss and just get your thirsts and get out of there. Jeez, that's so easy. It doesn't get much easier than that. But it does have its fair share of bullshit maps, especially on maddening. And if you play through it casually, it can definitely be daunting. I mean, right now I have a video up on my channel where I'm like, hey, I got soft locked on maddening New Game Plus, help. I think that shows that Three Houses is not just easy. But I think if you're remotely good at the game, then Three Houses overall belongs in easy. But, you know, maddening makes me kind of second guess myself and want to put it in mid. So let me know what your comments are on that. Last but not least, we have Fire Emblem Engage, and this one I think also goes in easy overall, but not as easy as it possibly could be. I think Engage, it might just be the fact that you have to get used to the mechanics for a while, but I think Engage early game especially is challenging enough to where it doesn't just belong in very easy, especially on the highest difficulty. It's just called maddening and Engage, right? Anyway, I think the early game is definitely very rough, but even on your first playthrough on hard when you're playing blind, it definitely throws a challenge at you. I think Chapter 5 is like peak difficulty for that game. But as you unlock more and more emblems, the game gets trivialized, and there are so many playthroughs of Engage up right now of people wanting to be able to see the game. And I think the reason that Engage draws these kind of playthroughs is because the Engage mechanic begs for it. Like the fact that you have a limited timer on this super powerful move, and then you can do an LTC playthrough where you condense all those powerful moves within 1 or 2 turns for most maps. I think that is somehow super appealing to a lot of people. So then you can just engage everyone turn 1 and use them for the entire chapter, which is going to be like 1, 2, or 3 turns, which I guess must be like a super satisfying draw to some people. They were like, oh, I have Sigurd. Let me see how quickly I can finish this map. I think that's a testament to how Engage affects people's minds when playing this game. Maybe it's just because I'm personally in a bit of a bubble where I see these runs in my feed, but that's just something I noticed that I wanted to mention here because I don't really have another place to do so. Anyway, what else do I want to say about Engage? So the early game is kind of tough, and then as you get more and more emblems, they get easier and easier. And then once you figure out some funny tricks you can do in the late game especially, and the amount of warps you get and how much mileage you can get out of Micaiah warping multiple people, some maps just become completely trivialized, almost to the point where they're as easy as Three Houses maps. They're not quite as easy because the houses are fortunately designed with the health bars, which makes them much more hard to skip. But people can still do it. It just takes a little bit more figuring out. But I think that really does a good job of diminishing the difficulty of the late game. You can still play these maps straight, but even if you're playing them straight, you have the means to survive enemies and wreck them. You could think of Ike as an example of someone who just almost trivializes entire enemy phases just because he takes slow little damage, no matter who he's on. Well, a reasonable tanky character. But then think of someone like Panette, who can Vantage and one-shot a bunch of enemies with ease. with just a little bit of meta knowledge, that also trivializes the enemy phase to a greater degree. Bonded Shield, another example of just an absolutely busted skill you have for the entire game, well, half the entire game, that just says, yeah, you don't take damage, really. Unless you get doubled, then you might take some damage, but generally you just don't take damage on multiple characters, as many times as you want. Stuff like that is not very fair to the enemy. Now, if you're playing for the first time, you might not know all these tricks, and so the game becomes a bit harder. And that's what's honestly what kept hard interesting for me in the first time, is just not knowing things. But the more you know about the game, the easier it becomes. This is true for all Fire Emblem games, but I think for Engage's difficulty, I think this is the reason why I would not put it in mid, but also why I wouldn't put it in very easy. So that's my reasoning there. So this is what I meant when I said that it would look very weird, because Awakening is not the hardest game in the franchise for most people, because they actively avoid playing a difficulty that they frankly think is bullshit. Most people don't like Lunatic or Lunatic Plus, and I think that's why you might not think Awakening is a very hard game, but if you only factor in the highest difficulty, then I think this is what you end up with. If you disagree though, let me know in the comments. I could be very wrong. I'm not equally experienced in all of these games, even though I have played them all. But yeah, this was fun to make. I do enjoy this kind of cross-game analysis comparison kind of thing, but I don't want to do them all in a off-the-cuff TOS video like this, because I think they deserve more. So eventually, when I'm done with the Emblem Ring analysis, I definitely want to do more cross-game content, because I think it could be very interesting to present it in a more, you know, scripted and final way. But for now, thank you for watching. Let me know what you think, and you know, if I'm super wrong about something, definitely let me know. I love to learn. See you all next time.